In this series, we've looked at a number of extremely common postural problems that people have in their legs. These problems combine to twist the legs, making full extension difficult and often resulting in pain or other irritating health concerns. Modern people are quite disconnected from their legs. We often tend to think of these problems in our legs and feet as something that happens to us, not something we control. And while there are some health problems that are out of our control, the majority of common problems that we have in our legs are quite visibly the result of how we use our legs. These problems, like bunions for instance, are the result of our habits, and there is actually some encouragement we can take from that. If part of our foot can be moved so far out of place by our habits, if we change our habits and use ourselves properly, we should be able to move just as far back towards a better configuration. The problem is most people don't know how they want to orient their feet and legs. And worse, much of the advice that is out there is dead wrong. So today we will recap the various problems that are common in the legs and feet, and we will also look at the ways we can counteract these problems. We'll start at the top end of the leg, where the head of the femur connects into the pelvis. We've seen many times that most people habitually rotate their pelvis forward and down. This will push the heads of the femurs forward, and we see this clearly in the way that people tend to have an angled upper leg. When the heads of the femurs are pushed forward like this, what happens is that the femur has to rotate as the pelvis moves forward. The head of the femur goes forward with the pelvis, while the greater trochanter, on the outside of the femur, goes back and out. That means there will be too much widening at the front, and the backs of the legs will be narrowed. But the lower leg will also compensate for this problem of too much weight forward at the upper leg, pelvis, and torso. People tend to pull their lower leg up to the knee back. To some degree, this stabilizes the leg. It prevents you from falling over, but it's also going to force you onto the front of your knee. That's a problem because your knee is reinforced at the back, not the front. This common misuse of the knee is part of why knee problems are so common. And it's no wonder why so many athletes end up with serious injuries to the ligaments of the knee. If you're sedentary, these problems in the knees may never result in injury, but if you're using your legs for vigorous exercise, this irrational way of using the knee poses a serious danger. When people pull their lower leg back, they also tend to rotate it out. We made a point on the head of the fibula and saw how people tend to pull the head of their fibula back and out. So far, we see a tendency for the outsides of the legs to be pulled back and out, while the insides of the legs are pushed forward and in. This problem continues into the foot and ankle. Most people tend to rotate their feet outward so that the toes point away from each other and the heels come closer together. This results in people standing and walking on the outsides of their feet, which is the opposite of what we want. We took an in-depth look at the close pack position of the foot and ankle. This is a configuration of the joints of the foot that make the foot rigid and the fascia taut. While there are times when we want our feet to be flexible, we do not want our feet to be malleable and flexible when we're walking or bearing weight. On the contrary, we want our feet to be as rigid as possible when walking so that our feet can be efficiently used as lever arms. Having the heels closer together and the toes apart is the exact opposite of what is needed to make the feet rigid, as is external rotation of the ankles, which is what occurs when the feet point out. And so naturally, problems in people's feet are quite common. But we see that these problems in the foot are connected to the problems in the ankle, knee, hip, and torso. In the legs, we see a back and out rotation at the outsides of the legs and a forward and in rotation at the insides of the legs. That's from the top end at the greater trochanter down to the toes. While that rotation can cause different problems and can present in different ways, this root problem is virtually always there, because it's the inevitable result of the pelvis spilling forward and down. And that problem of the pelvis is ubiquitous in the modern world. Before we look at correcting this problem, let's see if what I've described matches up with what we see in reality. While a problem like bowed legs can be caused by serious malnutrition and other causes that are outside of the scope of correcting your posture, if we look at milder cases of bowed legs, we see that the heels are pulled together and the head of the fibula is very far out. With knock knees, we see a rather similar problem. The backs of the lower legs are pulled very close together, which rotates the head of the fibula out. The feet will be moved far apart, with the toes being very far apart. If you look at people with flat feet, or those with overly high arches, you'll see this same tendency to rotate the feet and ankle outwards. Jando Masoero explains bunions, also called hallux valgus, as the result of the abductor hallucis being slackened and the adductor hallucis pulling the big toe outward unopposed. This problem essentially always coincides with external rotation of the ankle. While there are various ways to mitigate these problems, including surgery, is there something more practical we can do to avoid having these problems as we age? Well, of course, my answer is yes. We need to take conscious control over how we use our legs. To do that, just like with the torso, we will define spots on bones and create sets of directions for moving the spots relative to each other. We will put these directions into action simultaneously, and we can check to see if we've successfully followed our directions by using visual feedback in the form of video recording, a mirror, or having someone observe us. To begin with, our primary concerns should be to lift the iliacs back and up, to screw the ankles, which means internally rotating the ankles, to pull the head of the fibula forward and in, but also to pull the internal condyle of the femur, here at the inside of the upper knee, backward and out, and to rotate the femur generally forward and in at the outside and back and out at the inside, while making sure to abduct the legs. Abducting the legs here means pushing the insides of the legs apart and not allowing a collapse of the legs in towards each other. The feet should be placed so that they are straight at the outsides with the heels in line with the knees, which means the insides of the feet will be angled towards each other. The ultimate relation we're going for is one where our base is squared off. We want even distribution of the weight through both legs, which you'll find is actually quite uncommon in modern people. If the torso is properly brought backwards in space, you will have more weight going through the back and insides of the feet and knees, though you want to make sure you're going back by pulling your mid and lower torso back and not by pulling your upper torso back. The IT band, the major fascia of the leg, will be pulled taut by the weight of the torso, keeping the back of the pelvis down and the front of the pelvis up. The last thing I'll mention is that we want to move the upper leg backwards and up in relation to the lower leg, which is to be pushed forward and not allowed to go back with the upper leg. While this is a large set of directions for beginners, the more you put them into action, the more they will come to be the obvious choice. Eventually, you'll notice when you let your pelvis spill forward and you twist up your legs, and you'll observe how it's a senseless habit that's not even really comfortable. Once you have seen it as the hindrance that it is, and you have the understanding of how to combat it right there in your back pocket, you'll find that it just makes sense to use yourself in the way that actually makes sense. What you need to start that process is to remember your directions. Our memory is indeed something we need to train to improve our posture, and it's a skill like any other. If you work at remembering your directions and putting them into action during your day-to-day life, you will get better at it. Then, as long as you can follow your directions, you can decide to stand or otherwise use your legs in a more reasonable fashion. What I've given here is not an exhaustive list of the movements to consider with the legs. This is a starting point. But if you're even just able to screw the ankles and lift the iliacs, you should be able to make a noticeable change in how you stand. Thank you for watching this series about learning to control your legs. Hopefully, I've provided you with some strategies for using your legs more efficiently, and in time, we will get to some more specifics on consciously controlling the legs in action. If you'd like to get direct feedback on how you're adjusting your posture, I do offer lessons in the initial Alexander technique. In these lessons, which are conducted one-on-one over Zoom, you will be given various gestures to perform. When something starts to go wrong, I can immediately draw your attention to where you're deviating from what you intended to do. This is a very valuable tool for learning, because when you go back and watch the video of the lesson, you'll see how at first you fell into habit in some way and began to shorten in response to the requested gesture. Then you will see how just a moment later, when you apply the appropriate directions to the problem, you can perform the gesture differently and lengthen instead of shorten. Having that extra set of eyes that can give you feedback in the moment is something that can really accelerate your learning. It's one thing to go back and see where you succeeded and failed, but it's another to have someone who can give you immediate feedback as you're working. And of course, having someone challenging you and setting up movement puzzles for you will make you work harder and help you to advance and not stagnate. So if learning how to control your movements in a rational way is something you're interested in, please visit my website, mechanicsofpoise.com, to book a lesson or to learn more about the initial Alexander technique system. Thanks again for watching. Questions and comments are always welcome in the comment section below or at my email, delsartelessons@protonmail.com.